Let us learn sexual reproduction in flowering plants. The reproductive parts of angiosperms are located in the flower. Students, before we learn sexual reproduction in flowering plants, let us learn about two types of flowers. One type of flower is unisexual flower and second type is bisexual flower. The flower which contain either male reproductive part or female reproductive part is said as unisexual flower. Students, uni that means one, right? Unisexual. Uni means one, sexual means reproductive part. That way, remember what it is. A flower which contain either male reproductive part or female reproductive part is known as unisexual flower. Only one it will have, either male or female reproductive part. And the examples are papaya flower and watermelon flower. So these two are the examples of unisexual flower. So this papaya flower and watermelon flower contain either male reproductive part or female reproductive part, either stamen or pistil. So this type of flowers are called unisexual flowers. Then we have second type of flower, that is bisexual flower. Here, what does it mean? Bi means two, which means the flowers which have both male and female reproductive parts are called bisexual flowers. Male and female both reproductive parts, which means stamen and pistil. And the examples are hibiscus flower and mustard flowers. So this hibiscus and mustard flowers have both stamen and pistil. That is why they are called as bisexual flowers. Now let us start the topic. In your primary classes, you have already studied the different parts of a flower like sepals, petals, stamens and pistil. We know that stamen and pistil are the reproductive parts of a flower. And what do they contain? They contain germ cells. What are the other functions of other parts of the flower? Let us once again recall. Let us start with petals. What are petals? They are colored part of a flower which attracts the insects. Then look at the sepals, which are green in color. Sepal ensures protection to the flower. Then we have peduncle, which is also called as stalk, which holds the flower. Also we have receptacle, which is a thalamus, swollen part of a flower. Then we have reproductive parts of a flower, stamen and pistil. Stamen is the male reproductive part, whereas pistil is the female reproductive part. Let us know the structure of stamen and pistil. Here we have the structure of stamen. Stamen is the male reproductive part and it produces pollen grains, which are yellowish in color. In the figure you can see. Okay, so this yellow colored pollen grains are the male gamete. Who produces male gamete? Stamen. Stamen is the male reproductive part and it produces what? Pollen grains. And pollen grains are what? Male gamete. Please remember this. Okay. What are the pollen grains? Yellowish in color. You must have seen this yellowish pollen grains, which often sticks to our hands when we touch the stamen of a flower, right? I'm sure you have this experience. So this yellowish are the pollen grains, and here is the enlarged image of pollen grains, that how it looks. Okay, so what are these pollen grains? They are the male gametes produced by male reproductive part, which is stamen. Now, let us see about pistil. Pistil is the female reproductive part and it is present in the center of a flower. It is made up of three parts. Look at the figure carefully. It has three parts: stigma, style, and ovary. The topmost part is stigma. Style is the middle part. It connects the stigma and ovary. And ovary is what? The bottom part. Now, if you see the figure carefully, the middle long part is the style and the topmost part, that is sticky, which is known as stigma. What does this ovary contain? Ovary contains ovules and each ovule has an egg cell. So here the female gamete is ovum, or we can say egg cell, right? Pistil is the female reproductive part and which contains ovum or egg cells, and that are female gametes. It can be asked to you, name the male and female reproductive parts and gametes. So the male gamete is pollen grain and the main reproductive part is stamen. The female reproductive part of a flower is pistil and the female gamete is ovum or egg cell. Now, what happens? The male germ cell produced by pollen grains fuses, means combines, with the female gamete present in the ovule. So there is fusion of male gamete pollen grains and the female gamete, which is egg cell. Now, this fusion of the germ cells or fertilization, as I said, there will be fusion of male and female gametes. So that fusion is fertilization. So this fertilizations gives us the zygote, which is capable of growing into a new plant. So now let us see what is the process for it. We know that the male gametes are pollen grains. So pollen grains from the stamen needs to be transferred from the stamen to where? To the stigma of a pistil. Why? Because pistil is the female reproductive part. So the pollen grains from stamen has to come to stigma of a pistil. Now, this transfer can be done by two processes. It can be done by self pollination or it can be done by cross pollination. Now, as we know that one flower contain only stamen or pistil, that are unisexual flowers. There are bisexual flowers also which contain both reproductive parts. Okay. Now, this transfer of pollen grains to stigma can happen in one flower only, in the same flower. How? If there is a bisexual flower like hibiscus, then it will have stamen also, it will have pistil also. So the pollen grains from this flower that will be transferred to the pistil of the same flower. So the pollen grains from stamen will reach to stigma of a pistil, and this transfer is known as self-pollination when it is in the same flower. Okay, so let me tell you the perfect definition. If the transfer of pollen to stigma occurs in the same flower, in one flower, same flower, then it is known as self pollination. What will be then cross pollination? If the pollen grain is transferred from one flower to other different flower, then it is known as cross pollination. Simply, what you need to remember, self pollination, that means the transfer of pollen grains to stigma will be in the same flower. When there is cross pollination from one flower to another flower, there will be transfer of pollen grains. Now you will be thinking how this cross pollination can occur from one flower to another flower. So for doing this transfer of pollen from one flower to another flower, there are agents which help in the transfer of pollen to stigma. And what are they? They are wind, water, or animals. So, this type of factors like wind, water, or animals help this transfer of cross pollination from one flower to another flower. So, in the first step, the pollen grains from the stamen needs to be transferred either by self pollination or by cross pollination to stigma of a pistil. Now, the second step, when the pollen reaches on a suitable stigma, when it gets the perfect stigma, what happens? It has to reach the female germ cell. Now, where is the female germ cell? It is in the ovary. So, when this pollen grains occurs at the stigma, in the picture we can see clearly there are pollen grains on the stigma. So this pollen grains needs to be transferred to the ovary, because where is female germ cell? It is in the ovary. So that has to be transferred into the ovary. Now, stigma is the topmost part and ovary is the bottom part. How can this pollen travel from stigma to ovary? There should be some connection, right, for passing pollens from stigma to ovary. So there is a tube which has grown out of the pollen grain, and that tubes will help to travel through the style of the pistil. What is the style? That is the middle elongated part, and which help this pollen to travel from stigma to ovary. So here what did we see? That there will be a tube which grows out of the pollen grain. In the figure also you see that there is a tube which has started from pollen grains only, and it will travel through style. Style will help to travel the pollen to the ovary, and then there will be a fusion of a male gamete, that is pollen, and a female gamete, that is egg cell. So there will be fusion of these two gametes, and there will be fertilization. After fertilization, we know that the zygote will be formed, and that will be divided many times to form embryo within the ovule. We have already learned in our previous standards that when zygote divides many times, several times, which means what will happen? Different types of cells will be made, and as a result, what will be formed? Embryo. And here for the flower, after zygote divides many times and it forms embryo within the ovule. What will happen then? The ovule develops a tough coat and is gradually converted into a seed. As I said, that the ovule that develops a tough coat, which means covering, and slowly it will develop into a seed. At the same time, other parts of the flower like petals, sepals, stamen, style, and stigma may shrivel and fall off. What is the meaning of shrivel? Which means it will become dry, it will be wrinkled, and as a result, when it is dry, they will fall off. All these parts, which are the parts which will be shrivel and fall off: pistil, stamen, petal, all these parts. So, this is all about sexual reproduction in flowering plants. Let us recall it once again. Stamen is the male reproductive part. The topmost part is anther, and there is a filament kind of a structure. Anther has the pollen grains, and they are female gamete, and they need to reach to the female gamete during sexual reproduction. For this, there is a female reproductive part of a flower, that is pistil. It has three parts: stigma, style, and ovary. So the male gamete pollen needs to reach to stigma of pistil. So in the first step, the pollen will reach to stigma either by self pollination or by cross pollination, and then the female gamete, which is in the ovary. So to reach to the ovary, the pollen will develop a tube like structure from which the pollen travels through the style and reaches to the ovary. Then there is a fertilization of the egg, which is female gamete, egg or ovule. So in this picture, it is clearly shown egg and male gamete. So there will be fusion of this, and then after fertilization, the zygote divides several times to form an embryo with the ovule. Then the ovule develops a tough covering, and gradually it is converted into a seed. This ovary then grows rapidly and it gives fruits. There is an activity in your textbook that you need to take few seeds of Bengal gram, that is chana, and you have to soak them and keep it overnight. Then drain the excess water and cover the seeds with a wet cloth and leave them for a day. Then you have to open the seed carefully and you have to observe the different parts. So here germination is shown. What happens? There is a cotyledon which is for the food store. Then there is a plumule and the magnified image of plumule is shown, that it is future shoot. When it grows properly, it will be a future shoot. Which part? Plumule. Then there is a radicle, which is future root. So in the picture, the future root, that is radicle, and future shoot, that is plumule, both are shown. So this is the process of germination. What is germination? The seed contains the future plant or embryo which develops into a seedling under appropriate condition. This process is known as germination. What is a seedling? Seedling means a young plant raised from a seed. Now, as you can see, we have soaked the seeds of chana, right? The seeds were soaked. When you keep it wet for some days and when afterwards you observe, you cut it, that seed, and when you observe, you will see that there will be a seedling, that is a short young plant which will grow as the plant. So the seed contains the future plant. Here when we opened the seed, that time we saw that there is a younger plant which will be a future plant or embryo which develops into a seedling under appropriate conditions. What is a seedling? A young plant which is raised from seed. And this type of process is known as germination. So, there are the future plants inside the seeds only. There will be seed which contains the future plants which will grow as a seedling in appropriate condition. This is known as germination.